Hi, my name's Joe McLaughlin. We're here at the Lunenburg Public Access Studios today to learn a little bit about Dr. Robin Chandler. So let's get started. Hi, Robin.
Hi, Joe. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. We're here today to talk to you, to introduce you to the community.
Okay.
So you're an artist?
Yes. I'm an artist and I'm a social scientist and recently a member of the Lunenburg Cultural Council.
Terrific. Yeah, I've heard that the Cultural Council is growing.
It is. It is. It's growing in terms of membership, and it's growing in terms of the kinds of programs and interests that the council has historically been focused on, which is the administration of grants from the Mass Cultural Council to some new programs that might be coming up soon.
Yeah, we really appreciate the efforts that they're going through, because there's been a little bit of lack of culture since the committee was sort of dormant for a while.
Mm-hmm. And then there was COVID.
And then it's COVID, right? Right. So you're writing grants, you're coming up with programs. Tell me a little bit more about that. Is there something to writing grants? I don't know anything about that.
Yeah, we are not writing grants quite yet.
Okay.
That may evolve later during the coming year. Right now, there's a forthcoming program called the Artists in Schools program that is proposed. It's not official yet. Mm-hmm. And it may provide teaching artists, 4 of them, in Lunenburg Public High School over the course of 23-24. So we're excited about that, but it does not yet require any grant making.
Right, but the possibility is pretty exciting.
It is. Writing grants is very hard work, and one has to be aware of where the funding streams are going, who's providing grants for what, how the funding priorities may shift from 1 year or 8 months to the next 8 months. And it's important because there are also certain themes that a number of these funders prefer to focus on. Each of them can be very different in that, some of them will support school-based projects, others won't. Some of them will support independent artists, others won't. Some of them only support large institutions, dance companies or theater companies, and some don't. So you have to really be aware of who's got the money and how much they've got, and how frequently they disperse grants to how many people. They usually publicize all of this at the end or beginning of the grant cycle, depends. And so those are the kinds of things we're concerned with.
Right. It sounds like an arduous process. Is there certain things that you can do without grants that you could do in the community?
Sure. I mean, there's money in some surprising places other than the publicly documented official sites that you can find online, for example. Because oftentimes businesses and large corporations have investment plans that include things like what we used to call corporate social responsibility, or what we now call community engagement or community outreach. And so there usually are set-aside funds in the larger corporations, even local businesses, where they hope to invest in the community because, number one, it's a great tax write-off, and number two, it demonstrates to the community that they have some ownership in the community and some interest in the success and economic vitality of the community. It's a kind of giving back. So corporate social responsibility on the part of even small businesses can sometimes make a huge difference in the life of either an independent artist or a small company.
Well, speaking of artists, some people may not know, but you yourself are a practicing artist.
I am.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, I became an artist. I think that everyone has the capacity to become an artist, and I think the first thing that I learned through my dad, actually, was that with art, if you're going to become an artist, first you have to learn how to love yourself. and then love other people. If you can do one, you can do the other. But if you don't love yourself, you don't love your work. And if you don't love your work, people won't enjoy watching you fly across the stage in a dance performance or hear you read a piece of poetry. So I think that becomes the first thing for me from my experience. And my dad was my actually first mentor. I've had 2 or 3, which I've discovered late in life. Many people don't have mentors, but I was fortunate. My dad was my first mentor, and he taught me 3-point perspective when I was 6. Now, this isn't something that you would normally show to a 6-year-old. But I think what he was trying to do, that I realized later on, was he was teaching me how to look at what the inner workings of an object or a thing are. What is the infrastructure that holds a thing up, whether it's the human body or a dog or a building? And so he ultimately taught me how to think and how to look at the world, to not only take for granted what I see on the surface of things, but understand that there is an inner life to all life, whether it's a blade of grass or it's a rock, that there are other things going on, that everything's always in motion. So I appreciated that fact because it gave me an appreciation not only of art, but of people.
Absolutely. Can you tell us about a little bit about some of your other mentors and what they meant to you?
There's an American artist who's passed on to the next world now. Her name was Lois Mailou Jones, and by the time she died, her work was selling in the 6 figures. So she was a prominent American artist, and she became a mentor of mine in my 30s, which again was very fortunate because she had already lived her life through the art movements of the 1920s and all those subsequent eras. She lived the full range of the 20th century. She didn't die until her 90s, in the last decade of the 20th century. And what she taught me had nothing to do with art, but how to be an artist, particularly as a woman. Historically, most art worlds are driven by masculine perceptions and masculine authority and the patriarchy, if you will. And these are male-dominated industries. All of the arts are. And so women functioning in this industries had to find over time a way to make a life for themselves, a way to promote their own work, a way to have a career path that had a trajectory of success, hopefully. Lois was a slave driver of me personally. And I don't use the term loosely or disrespectfully. She literally, because I would regularly get missives from her, whether it was letters from Paris where she happened to be, or newspaper clippings from West Africa where she was, or wherever she happened to be in Washington, D.C., asking me, when I was showing next, and where was I exhibiting, and why didn't this happen, and why didn't I phone so-and-so for help doing such and such, and, oh, by the way, how's your daughter? Write me soon and tell me, when you're coming to the vineyard. She had a summer house on Martha's Vineyard, and on 2 separate years, actually, because she had a gallery at her home, she had exhibitions of my work in her gallery, which of course thrilled me, and it thrilled her too, because I understand now in retrospect that most artists, I think, want to see themselves reproduced in the world. You want to see that the young people who are coming up behind you are taking care of business, that they're pursuing the path of creativity that they love, whether it's drumming or musical arrangements and composition, or writing books, or sculpture or murals or whatever. You want to see that people understand the empowering and ancient way in which human beings have expressed themselves through the various media that we now call art. We've been doing this, expressing ourselves through the arts for 64,000 years. If you think about the first rock engravings, why, if you were a Neanderthal, would you stop to make paintings on rocks? Unless you had a passion to tell your story. And that's what we all have. We have this passion to tell our story, to express our story, what we see, what we feel, what we think, what we're angry about, what we want to see changed, what we don't want to see change. what we think about beauty, how we describe or define beauty. All of us want to pursue these stories. And in everything there is a story, whether it's a piece of sculpture or a poem. My medium happens to have been mixed media collage. I do large wall scale collages, which is very, very labor intensive. Cutting the minutiae of things free-handed. I came up with a terminology for it called drawing with scissors. And that's what I basically do. I cut everything out with scissors and then go through this very tedious process with several layers of, ultimately pasting and gluing everything down. It's very old school, but it's very satisfying. Mm-hmm. And I think that every artist has to be satisfied with the medium that they're in. It's why some artists move back and forth between media, because they like playing the guitar, but they like painting.
Right.
But there's something similar in it. And this is, as artists, the pursuit of freedom. It's why we discuss it so frequently, particularly when it comes to repressive governments around the world, or the idea of censorship. Whether it's art or journalism, is that people have to be free to express themselves. That's how we change and improve our lives as a species, is by expressing ourselves, learning and hearing about new ideas, and coming up with the means to transform our society. Because it's very clear after COVID that our society is suffering from major crises that are coming to a mount. And so one of the things we learn in art, and you don't know this really going into art all the time, it's something you learn on the way, is about risk-taking. Right. Yo-Yo Ma, the musician, talked about this frequently. He talked about the ways in which there is a connection between passion and risk-taking. And your passion for something has to be very deep. If it's not very deep, you'll be afraid to take risks.
Well, it's personal.
It's very personal.
Self-exposure. You're out there naked for the world to see.
And it's very disturbing in some ways.
Yeah.
You're exposed. You're
Exactly.
vulnerable.
But that's the only way to get to your story.
That's the only way to get to your story. So oftentimes you don't get there alone. You get there with your audiences, with the spectators, the people who are involved in your work. It helps you understand your story. What I do is working on the wall. So I create two-dimensional objects that you hang on a wall in a traditional salon standard. But several years back, in the time of the Rodney King crisis, I'm dating myself a bit, but that's okay. The Rodney King crisis came along, and I make these big, beautiful, high-color, objects. And the Rodney King incident was a horrific event, violent and oppressive. And yet, as an artist, like most artists, I felt the need to express myself in some way. And I had to find a way to do that.
Right.
What aided me to do that was the fact that I was a social scientist at the same time. Different fields have different methodologies for collecting information or collecting data in order to develop theories and ideas that they then test and they develop products and outcomes from. And
one must feed the other.
Absolutely.
The art and the social scientists.
This was the brilliant thing that I didn't realize until I actually started working a great deal full-time in both fields in my 40s. That's when it first hit me, that one partners with the other beautifully if you time it properly and your thinking is clear, if you have the kind of strategic thinking that can help you do this. And so I realized I have to come off the wall, so to speak. I have to come off the wall to express what I feel about this incident, because this was tragic and it shouldn't repeat itself. But I have to express to people how I feel. I have to give plastic form to this concept, this event in history. So I had to develop certain materials. Once I developed the conceptual design, I had to come up with the materials. And it involved reproducing the incident where the beating took place. I mean, it was pretty ugly. It was out on a roadside somewhere at night. And so what I did was I went to Boston Sand and Gravel, which does the sand and gravel thing like you guys have out here with Keating and the other firms. And the man I went to said, what do you need? What can I help you with? And I said, I need some sand. And he said, well, how much? I said, I don't know. How do you give them out? He said, cups. They come in cups. I said, well, how much is a cup? And so we had this very amusing conversation. He says, I think you need about a cup and a half. I said, okay, I'll take a cup and a half. Then I had to inform the curator of the exhibition where this was going to be, and she was nail-biting, extremely nervous about bringing gravel into this very beautiful gallery at what was, at the time, the Prudential Bank Gallery. But I assured her there would be a tarp down, and they would come in and deliver the sand, and the sand would stay on that. I then had to, because I had another element, two other elements that I had to include in this, and one was a plaster cast. I had to get a volunteer to help me, allow me to make a plaster cast like this, as if a person was trying to prevent these nightsticks from hitting you. So that was in the middle of the mound, and all of this was in white. And I went into what used to be in Boston on Boylston Street, there used to be an Army and Navy store. And so I went into the gentleman and I said, do you have nightsticks? And he says, well, we have nightsticks and batons. I said, what's the difference? So he explained the difference. And I said, I'm really not sure. He said, let me bring them out and I'll show them to you. So he brought them out. And I said, the big one. So he says, okay, I'll go get one. I said, no, I want 21. Well, he looked at me up and down, wondering why this young woman wanted 21 batons. So I had to explain to him what art was. I had a beautiful conversation with this guy about what art was and why artists conceive of ways to express things that are sometimes not always beautiful. They're oftentimes oppressive and they're oftentimes ugly.
Well, it sounds like there's a fair amount of research behind your artwork because you are trying to create a narrative, and often there's research involved, and the plus side is you get to meet a lot of great people.
Absolutely.
And
I did in this case, because along with this installation piece, I created a poem. And the poem tapped into my social science research methodology to do something called content analysis. You can analyze the content of anything. I wanted to analyze the content of the responses of individual human beings to this beating. What did other people think? What did other people feel? So I stopped in my old neighborhood where I had grown up because the gentleman that had been the friend of my dad's was buying a piece of my work. So I said, Mr. So-and-so, what do you think about the Rodney King incident? He sat up very straight like a king and he said, black people fight on impulse, white people plot. And
interesting.
I could not have staged that if I had tried.
Yeah.
I was done in a matter of 40 seconds.
Yeah.
I had one of the pieces of content that would analyze a much larger rhythm of responses. So I would read newspapers, stories about what people had said, and I would include those. At the time, Bill Bradley, who had played with the Knicks, the New York Knicks,
I'm familiar with
but
him.
who was now, it was at the time a state senator.
Yeah.
Happened to be standing up at one of the televised meetings. And he stands up and he says, let me see, I wonder what it feels to get hit 82 times in 64 places by 21 people. And I sat up and I said, I'm watching this,
Right.
And he literally stood at the podium and he made marks on the way carpenters do when they're going 4 strokes and then 5, 4 strokes and then 5. And as he did this on the pad of paper, he said, pow, 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 pow. And
he really personified what exactly
it was
happened.
Again, it was like, this was destiny. This poem was destiny.
Right.
Because I was having the performative emerge from everyday people of all types, saying all sorts of absolutely extraordinary things about their impressions of this particular moment in television history, in criminal justice history,
Right.
in race in America history. It was
Right.
extraordinary.
Right.
I had to be guided by forces outside of myself because this was not my métier. I'm used to working on the wall. And I was taking a great risk. And I'll get back to why I'm a risk taker in a minute. But I took a great risk. And when this was presented during the exhibition reception, the man who was running the residency program that I belonged with, along with these other artists, came over to me and he says, there are no words. And he gave me a kiss on the forehead and walked away.
Wow.
And many people did that because he knew me. He could appreciate that this took enormous courage for me to do this because, I was putting my stuff out there in a way I hadn't ever
Right.
before. There were also a couple of people that hated it. And one has to be prepared for that.
Right.
Not everybody loves you, so what?
No.
Not everybody loves your work, know. And not everybody understands what it is you're trying to express. It was, I will admit, a little clumsy, but I felt a little clumsy because I was completely out of touch with this kind of violence, personally.
The event was really, really shocking, and the fact that you were able to take pieces of that event, the very lowest denominator, the things that really mattered,
Right.
and bring that for the society to see,
Right.
made a difference.
Right, right. It was true, but it was a risk I was willing to take because I felt very deeply about it, and because I could not figure out how to make something beautiful out of it. I thought about it for a long time. I talked to people about it.
Right.
And many other people were doing expressions that were representationally trying to depict or reproduce the idea of violence.
Right.
But it was, for me, ineffable. I didn't know how to do that, and so I had to just put it in the ugliest form I could sort of think of.
Right.
So this risk, has to do with what happened to me as an asthmatic child when I was 10. And I was standing on the top board of the 3-meter board at summer camp. And I have asthma. And when you're a child with asthma, all you think about is getting air. And the prospect of hitting the water, being propelled, terrified me. And I turned back to look at all the rungs on the ladder. There was someone on every rung, so there was no way down that way. The waterfront instructor, Mr. Dick was his name. He was a former Marine with the crew cut and the tan body and all that sort of stuff. But we adored him. And he was very, very, very good with us. And I wouldn't move. I froze. So he's got the megaphone. He says, "Jump!" And I said, "No." And he says, "Jump!" I said, "No." I knew, things come in threes. And I knew the third one was going to be, "Don't make me come up there."
Right.
So I jumped. And, of course, it feels like it's an hour. There's the step you
Yeah.
take before you
Yeah.
even, and then there's going down. And you're only 10, so I was just a little thing, and you go down very fast. It was near the docks, so it wasn't really all that deep. Pulled myself up, swam over to the dock, grabbed the side of the dock. He was kneeling there this far away from me, and he looked at me, said, "You liked it, didn't you?" And I said, got right up and got right back in the line again.
Well, being an artist is, from what I'm learning, is a collection of experiences. And the more life experience you have, the more you have to draw on, or
Absolutely.
do you know what I mean?
Absolutely, absolutely. Those are
can't be
things that I think of.
Right.
I thought, so I grew up taking risks all the time. Advisedly, I'm a cautious girl, but I grew up taking risks, and I grew up with my parents supporting me taking risks. Speaking of the swimming metaphor, neither of my parents could swim. They were Depression kids. Not that has anything to do with swimming or not, but that's the era they were from. But we have tons of family photographs of my parents in the water, but they're only at the very edge of the water.
Right.
They're lounging like they just came in off of a swim and all that sort of stuff. Neither one of them could swim, but they made sure that my older brother became a lifeguard. And I had to do everything my older brother did, so I became a lifeguard. So the idea of the water was a fear that my mother wanted me to overcome so that my asthma would not control my life. I literally conquered asthma because of swimming, I've remained a swimmer to this day.
So you're a risk taker since childhood.
Since childhood, that it's
Yeah.
not a big deal.
Right.
It's something you have to consider. You have to consider the outcomes, consider the environment, surroundings, your own particular disposition at the time, feelings, health, etc. But if it's something about jumping off a cliff, jump off the cliff. Two things are going to happen. You're going to fall down and kill yourself, or you're going to stand up, dust yourself off, and get on with it.
Right.
And that's kind of the way art for me functions in terms of the business aspects of it. But
In terms of business, I'm curious, what's it like to have an exhibition? What is I don't know if I want you to get into the total process of it, but what is the situation? How does it work? And could you tell us a little bit about your artist in residency time?
sure, the idea of producing something is a process. The artist is thinking about the process. They're not thinking so much about the product. They know the product's going to be there because that's how you show the result of your journey, whether it's the musical arrangement or whether it's the piece of choreography or whether it's the mural or whether it's the sonnets that you're writing, whatever it is. The process of getting there is the real learning experience. It's where you do learn to love yourself, because if you don't love yourself, you don't love your work. And if you don't, why should other people? So whatever kind of work it is, you have to convey that idea that self-love is in place, that you have a healthy ego, that you enjoy making these things, you know you're good at it, and that you know how to explore it, because it may not always look the same. It will go through transformative changes over the course of your life. You may switch media from one to the other. But the idea of the residency has been important to my life. I don't know about other artists, but I've been in many residencies with many artists, so I have to assume that other artists feel similarly. But the residency is a space of solitude, which the artist already has. I mean, if you don't like being with yourself for long periods of time, you need to find another line of work. Because if you're the kind of person that needs to be around people a lot, it's a very lonely and I would imagine uncomfortable process. I spent a lot of time alone as a kid, only because my brother was almost 10 years older than me. So by the time he was 16, I was, 6. And I spent a good deal of time alone. And so it was an incubation space, if you will, for learning how to entertain myself, spend time with myself. As I mentioned, my dad had always taught me to draw, so that was always a part of my time with myself. My parents had sent me to the Museum of Fine Arts by the time I was 11, 12. I was getting on the bus from Cambridge, where I was from, taking the bus into the MFA, because at the time they had a children's division, and I studied drawing and composition from there. I actually still have some of the drawings. I can't believe it. I found them about a week ago. And my father, the mentor, gave me instructions, as he always did, about everything, how to do this and how to do that. And he said, after your class, I want you to go to the such and such gallery and look at the so-and-so. And I'm like, Dad, is it not enough that I go to the class and study? He says, no, I want you to go see the monumental Egyptian collections. There's only a few places in the world that have a collection like that, and I want to hear about it when you get back. He would do this through my teens. I attended parochial school. Parochial schools at the time I attended them used to be like private schools. We had a ton of homework. I'm like, Dad, I don't have time to read this. I have to do this other. He said, I'm going to ask you questions about it too. And then he would disappear.
What a wonderful mentor.
It was pretty extraordinary. In retrospect, yeah, I mean, who gets, you get the stage mother, but he wasn't being a stage father. He
No.
was guiding my intellectual life without me realizing it. And I am so grateful. I was given exactly the right dad for me, because I ended up being a girl who had dreams. And if you were a girl who had dreams in the 50s and the 60s when I grew up, good luck with that. You were supposed to find a guy, pop out some babies, and then fulfill the man's dreams for the rest of your life. But you see, what my dad did is he saw that coming. He had just raised a son in a man's world, and he saw this little slightly weird girl child, and he said, okay, I'm going to have to give her some armor so she can navigate this wild and crazy world out there. And he taught me a lot of habits and traits that men sort of do. They weren't kind of the most appropriate things. There were things like, walk into a room like you own it. Look at people straight in the eye when you do business with them and never let them know what you're really thinking.
Is it harder to navigate as an artist or easier? I mean, that's a blanket question, but
Depends on
do
the
you
artist.
feel, right, do you
Depends
feel
on the
like
artist.
for you,
I do walk into the room like I own
Yeah.
it as a woman artist.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, they'll go, who's she?
right,
What is she doing here?
right,
You know, they treat men different when men artists walk into the room. They just do. And so the only way you can overcompensate for that is by doing what they do, but not quite as brutally and quite as authoritatively, and very consciously within limits, you know? So I think you have to have a physical presence. You have to have a verbal presence with people. You have to be able to interact with people, even though you live this life of solitude where you make things. And, you know, you were asking earlier about exhibitions, and the thing about the spectator, the audience, is that they see you on the concert night or the reception night or whatever it is. They have no clue about the drudgery that you went through the last 2 years or however long to make this body of work.
right,
It's not that they think that there's anything right or wrong about it. They're just completely uninformed, unless they're artists themselves, about what it takes. And one of the things it takes is a challenge that a lot of engineers have, and that is engineers are trained in terms of the fabrication, conceptualization and fabrication of projects to make mistakes, but to accept mistakes as part of the learning process. Oh, gee, now I know one way not to do it. Oh, now I know 3 ways not to do it. And eventually you get, well, art is that way too, at least for me. I mean, I can't tell you how many drawings or sketches I would go through on any particular thing, and you just go, oh, this is horrible. They're all over the floor, you know, there's. And then you finally say, okay, I can't do any better than this. It's not perfect, it's not going to be perfect, but I cannot do any better than this. I will oftentimes, with collages, work on 4 or 5 of them at the same time. I have them laid out on flat tables, at least when I had a big studio I did. Because I also have a short attention span and I get bored really easily. So
I was just going to ask you, do
Yeah.
you find for an artist or perhaps for yourself, do you find that there are limitations, or is it more free than that? What have you found in your experience, or what do you think about other artists?
I think it is the drudgery, and other artists may not use the same word. It's work. It's really hard work. And, you know, again, it's one of those fields that if you're not prepared to work at it every day, or almost every day, you should find another line of work. Because you need enough time to make enough mistakes to get to the truth. Because James Baldwin, one of the most prominent writers of the 20th century, wrote some of the greatest American literature, said, art is about disturbing the peace. And former President Jack Kennedy just sort of, you know, followed up by saying, you know, art is not propaganda, it's the truth. And so if you sort of put these two together, from two guys from the 20th century, you'll see that they had their finger on the pulse of what creativity and art is. And that is, it's a process of shaking the tree. You know, Baldwin's work made Americans look at the fact that America was not a perfect place for a lot of people. And so it helped us detach from the myth of what America was to the reality of what America was and what it had become over time. And so many times art is like that. Films do that for us. A poem can do that about it. Pablo Neruda's poems I love, you know, from Chile, because they're so personal, but they also speak about the political self. What is our responsibility? I happen to think that artists are as important as diplomats, it's as important as negotiating a peace. To create a poem or a book or a play or a dance that gives us a person's eye view into what oppression means or what love is.
Like an artist, a writer can have people feel like they know what they're saying. They can draw people to an idea.
By the way they express it, by the colors they use, the language they use, a conversation in a novel can transform a person. A conversation between two characters in a novel or a play and you're completely mesmerized with this. It becomes unforgettable. It becomes imprinted on your mind because this person stepped outside of themselves to do this. You know, there is the way in which the late Leonard Bernstein, Bostonians will know him, but the late Leonard Bernstein said that artists somehow, for reasons that we don't really know, need to make one note follow the next note in such a way that when you're done with it, you feel like all's right with the world or all's wrong with the world.
Right.
But that's because of the way they just arranged notes that produced a particular sound that it affected us in a particular kind of way. I know a lot of people in my generation used to call Baryshnikov when Baryshnikov would dance, and he'd do those leaps across the stage, and everybody would swear that he was suspended in space for at least 3 or 4 seconds. It did look like that. It must have felt like that for him.
Yeah.
You know, so how exhilarating it must have been for him, and how absolutely magical for us to see that use of the human body to create that awe-inspiring fantasy that we can fly when we know we can't. I mean, AI may take us there,
Well,
there soon.
Robin, you have made us fly through your artwork, and you've taught us so much today about you. I am thrilled that you were here, and it's wonderful that you're part of the Lunenburg Cultural Council. One more quick question. I was just going to close, but
Okay.
I'm curious to know, how did you end up in Lunenburg?
This is my fireworks story. I wasn't drawn to Lunenburg for anything other than I was driven from Boston by the fireworks phenomena that was happening sort of mid-COVID, where kids were setting off firecracks beginning as early as April in the year before we moved here. And it would start at 6 or 7 o'clock at night, and on weekends it might go to 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. It was incessant. It turns out that it was a national problem. There were other cities in America that had this problem too. The police at first couldn't figure out how to track this problem down. Ultimately, they figured out that there were middlemen who were buying firecrackers in states where it was legal to buy them and taking them over the border of Massachusetts where it was not, and selling them to young kids. In the middle of COVID, they have nothing to do, they're bored, and this became a phenomena that traumatized every city and town and neighborhood where this happened. You had people with PTSD from veterans in wars. You had people who had mental illness who were disturbed. You had mothers and fathers trying to get babies to sleep. You had pets who were like freaking out. Every single aspect of humanity was disturbed, and even the police themselves, as I found out one evening when I called to complain to the police department in Boston, and I practically had the woman who answered the phone in tears because she said, you know, I have babies too. I can't get my kids to sleep at night. So this was seemingly an insolvable problem, and we weren't willing, my family wasn't willing to put up with it anymore, and so we just said, we gotta get away from this. There's a better way, there's a better life. Of course they got to the bottom of that problem, thank God. And thank the police and thank research and thank, you know, all the people who did the hard work to track the problem down and solve it, which is, of course brings us back to what art is. And this is why we need to train kids in executive function skills like problem solving, because these young people are the future leaders and decision makers and are going to face far more complicated problems than we have even right now. So one of the things that's happening in Lunenburg, hopefully, is a proposed Artists in Schools program that the Lunenburg Cultural Council will hopefully review and hopefully vote to approve, along with the Board of Selectmen and the high school principal and the superintendent of schools. They've all been presented this idea, this concept, and it seems like it might fly.
That's terrific, and we're so glad you're here in Lunenburg, working for the Cultural Council, and everyone on the Cultural Council. We appreciate. So thanks for coming in today. It was great getting to know you, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thanks very much. We are pushing the envelope here on a rush against school deadlines to an above-average school to identify purpose, a new purpose. And that purpose is the Artisan Schools program and a strengthened cultural council. Should you seed fund this initiative in the arts, in the creative industries, now referred to globally as the orange economy, you are guaranteeing that future economic investors and grantors will fund projects in Lunenburg. More importantly, you are telling the youth of Lunenburg that they matter as the next generation leaders and decision makers of the town. Vitalization of the arts community in town is critical. They are your primary influencers, and mobilizing them will support and enrich both the council and the AIS, or Artisan Schools program. These two people in the schools with the children of Lunenburg High School, the youth, will be an extraordinary contribution to the school. The high school is in the top 5% of high schools in the state. I don't know, I'm assuming you all know that, but it's considered an above-average high school. It's a fairly new facility. It has 3 dedicated art instructors and 17 courses. This is unheard of in most schools that are not in big cities. And that was what first caught my eye about the potential of having this kind of a program in that kind of a school, is that you already have 3 dedicated arts instructors.
It directly addresses education. It directly addresses the arts, which is, of course, long overlooked, so often overlooked as people try to turn STEM into STEAM. I mean, she didn't, Dr. Chandler didn't mention that tonight, but at her presentation she does. Everybody else has just pasted the A in STEM to make STEAM. But here's an opportunity to really bring something worthwhile with high caliber people in their field to do this. I mean, you could not ask for a better opportunity. That's why I encourage them strongly to bring it to the board, because we do have this money. The impact it would have would be enormous and would potentially catapult this into the National Endowment of Arts funding to say, hey, listen, we have funded at a local level a program like this. This could get you entry into the bigger party. So for all of those reasons, I think, I could not be in more support of this, even at the time that we're talking about. There is no doubt in my mind that the Cultural Council will get this coordinated with the school, because everybody there will see the opportunity.
That money will be more easier to access given the kind of approval that the selectmen here might approve.
The Lunenburg Cultural Council ran into a lot of roadblocks, as everybody else did during COVID. During the pandemic, so many things were put on hold, so many programs were canceled, so much had to be pushed forward within Massachusetts and every other state, obviously. And we are really dedicated to promoting the arts, the culture, as well as sciences at different levels in Lunenburg.
It brought to mind, the adage that opportunity is not a lengthy visitor here. So, there's 3 things that make things happen. There are ideas, there's energy, and there's money. We have 2 of them already.
I commend you guys for wanting to bring like a certain level of innovation to public schools. It sounds like a really cool program, and I think it has a good opportunity to really inspire creativity. I'm also just more generally grateful for the efforts that you guys are doing to develop the art community here in town. So I look forward to seeing what else you guys do.
It's really exciting to get to see some of the ideas coming out of the Cultural Council. I know that a lot of things happen when you have the energy behind it to make it happen, as well as the skill sets needed to pull all the people you need to pull together.
In order to create a marketing buzz for this kind of a program, you have to touch base with a lot of people who have an interest not only in the curriculum at the Mass Department of Education, but the Mass Council itself and several other cultural institutions in the state.